Should Trump win a Nobel Peace Prize? Will peace last in the Middle East now that a ceasefire has taken place between Israel and Hamas? What's wrong with graffiti in a cathedral, and what explains the rise of religious hate crime in the United Kingdom? Just some of the questions we discuss on today's episode of Cross Section.
Well, hello and welcome to Cross Section, the show where we discuss the intersection of faith and culture and all that is going on in the news this week. I am joined by Danny in the studio in London.
Hello.
Hello. And Alicia in the studio in London.
Afternoon, everyone.
And tomorrow I get to be with you in person, but for now I am in Northern Ireland. So wonderful to be with you both. We are discussing the big stories of the week, as we often do. But first, we are going to look at a couple of little stories that caught our eye. Alicia, Andy Burnham.
Oh, wow. We're starting there already. So, yes, Andy Burnham, who's the mayor of Manchester, was the keynote speaker for Theos, a kind of a religious kind of think tank in the public square. What's the role of religion? At their annual summit, he was the keynote speaker, and Andy Burnham spoke interestingly two things. First thing that he said, or second, was really trying to drive forward and encourage that government should do God, which is, he spoke openly about how in previous Labour government, they weren't keen to talk about faith in the public square and the role of faith. And yet he, in his role as Mayor of Manchester, has engaged incredibly well with different faith communities, including the evangelical kind of member organisations. I'm very aware of the Liverpool Lighthouse engaging well with him and others in that area, talking about the importance that faith communities do and bring in kind of addressing the social ills in society and building trust. So that was one of his key points in the lecture, talking about faith. And then interestingly, somewhat undoing that, where he loves the doing of faith communities and what they bring to society, but then saying about his own experience growing up Roman Catholic, that he struggles with parts and elements of kind of Christian teaching around biblical sexual ethic, marriage, and said that was for him a point where he fell away from faith and still questions that part of it. So it was kind of an interesting conversation, amplifying faith, but equally being honest that there are aspects of faith that he doesn't agree with.
And it was interesting, he was also speaking on Radio 4, I think on the Sunday programme, and it was the presenter was pushing him quite a lot about his own personal faith, his own personal engagement, about whether he believed, whether he went to church. He describes himself as an agnostic. And it is interesting because I know people who would say that he has had really, really, really good relationships with Christian groups and churches in Manchester. And I don't doubt that, but he kind of likes it in a slightly transactional way.
Yeah.
He likes what the churches are doing. He likes their homelessness work. He likes the work to tackle poverty. He likes it where churches are community actors. And that's all very good. Like, I think that is all very good. But I'm not sure there's anything that he likes about churches and other perhaps faith communities that couldn't be delivered by someone else. It's just that they are delivered by churches. And I don't think he always gets below to ask that question as to, well, why is it the churches that are doing this rather than any other social organisation?
Well, it's like our boss sometimes says, he met with a previous faith minister and was talking about the work the churches did. And they said, we love that, but we're a bit nervous about some of the things you do. Could you just not drop that? And he said, well, if you can find £1 billion, we'll drop it. And they said, why? I said, well, that's what it's going to cost to replace it. It all comes together as part of a package. It's what drives us, is our beliefs in this moment. And it drives our commitment to serve the other, but also some core ideas. Danny, I'm going to come to you for your story of the week, because I believe you're a bit of an art critic, or maybe you're a supporter of the arts at Canterbury Cathedral, which has been in the headlines.
Yes, well, Canterbury Cathedral, either the site of the great desecration of one of our great cathedrals, or perhaps cutting-edge artistic apologetics innovation. And I think the answer is neither of those. It's quite a cringe installation with graffiti-style stickers. They are stickers, not graffiti, all over the walls and pillars, posing fairly standard apologetics questions. It's quite hard to read some of them because of the style in which they have been created, graffiti style. But this has got massively amplified, particularly by J.D. Vance posting on X about this, and others that just seem to have lost all sense of discernment. You might not like it. You might think it's rubbish. I think it's quite rubbish. But one, it is fairly standard apologetics stuff, the questions they're asking. Whether they are then able to help people in the answering of those questions is a different thing. But also, they are stickers. They're not painting all over the walls. They're not destroying Canterbury Cathedral. And people just are, I just marvel at the lack of discernment people seem to have in some of their engagement with some of these stories of kind of England has fallen. This is the end.
England has fallen, but that's not the reason. Danny, you probably have more. You probably have more problems with people painting on your own walls, knowing your children and their age.
Felted pens.
I do think it's much ado about nothing. I agree. I don't mind them. I can't read half them. That was definitely a problem. But I mean, the idea that the Vice President of the United States was going to weigh in for some stickers in the cathedral. There are things we should be concerned about. There are serious problems with the Church of England. This is not one of them, in my view. I'm with you on that, Danny. Alicia, any comment on the vandalism, graffiti?
Vandalism? No. Yeah, well, in part, I think the pushback to JD Vance is, why is JD Vance again getting involved in UK politics or UK stories when he doesn't need to be? And then I was thinking, actually, isn't JD Vance Catholic? Am I true to say that before I then make the point? Okay, so maybe for him, his faith expression, and this is me reading between the lines and reading into a story that could be 100% wrong, but I just want to offer an alternative and a possible defense for why he has such strong opinions about something so minor. Is it because for him, the place of worship is a place of reverence that needs a level of seriousness to it that actually could the cathedral think differently about engaging outside politics through the arts in more of a curated space, rather than in the middle of worship, people are seeing a random sticker that is present and their kind of reverence for and worship to the Lord is completely remiss. And maybe there's just a difference of communication between Catholics and the Protestants in terms of how do we treat our sacred places. Now, I know the church is not a physical building. However, it's one of the key sacraments for Catholics in that sense, in that place of worship. So maybe his strength of feeling about something so minor is because of the way he practices faith. That was just me on a good day trying to see the other point of side.
Oh, what a
I know.
generous
It's
reading
rare.
towards the Vice President in the
God's
particular
doing the work, people.
Well, you've changed, Alicia. You've changed. We want the old Alicia back. No doubt it's coming in the rest of this episode. When we will be looking at Israel-Palestine, we will be looking at rehabilitation in prison, and we will be looking at hate crimes. One last story from me was, well, two aspects of Tommy Robinson, dare I say, Tommy. I listened to a podcast with Jonathan Sacradotti, I think is his name, liberal Jew. So that's, I think, how he described. Really interesting listening to Tommy Robinson talk about his interaction with faith and other things. But probably the reason that was catching me this week is he is in court again, this time under Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act 2000, of which I have an increased interest as somebody from Northern Ireland who has to go through different parts of airports and go past those signs, although it applies to us all. And I was intrigued, even knowing a little bit about that, about the wide powers under that act, and that basically you can stop pretty much anyone. You don't need to have cause and reasonable suspicion, and they must answer your questions truthfully, and they must give up things like the PIN code to their phone and access to all digital devices. You can be held for up to 6 hours, and as I understand it, you don't have a right to make a phone call during that period, and you can be searched, etc. So very wide-ranging powers that were used to stop Tommy Robinson. I just find this intriguing. His court case has been paid for by Elon Musk. He's running around talking about the press. Well, he said it.
Okay.
But that could still add the word allegedly. I think the whole thing is really interesting around the free speech. I have both interest and problems with Tommy, but I find the story really intriguing and how it's being covered and how it's being engaged with. And I do find the powers under that act somewhat disconcerting. It's very different if you're on your way and they have reasonable suspicion to believe you're in the process of carrying out an act of terrorism. But the powers have been significantly widened. And it is just a reminder of some of the legislation that we have in place for me in this moment. In a border area is critical, which really just applies to Northern Ireland, and then at a port of any variety. these powers come into play. So the rest of you may not be as interested. I'll let either of you comment as we wrap up this.
Well, I think it is interesting. And I think the scope within particularly terrorism legislation is very wide. What I think is interesting is how we view the use of those powers depending on who it relates to. In that, like Tommy Robinson, he's in court, he must have done something wrong. Surely they were justified in using those powers. On other occasions, we might be like, that's outrageous, absolutely awful that the police would use those powers, rather than saying, actually, regardless of who it is, was it justified? Is it a reasonable use of those powers? Or is it just an overstretch without reasonable grounds, without evidence, without anything else? Like, is it something that should cause us to question whether those powers are in place, and being able to make that kind of judgment regardless of the person who it might be being applied to?
I think my only input to that, and just reflecting in a different area, is where there's such distrust between the police, the state, and the individual or community. In this case, I'm thinking, would I exchange my own personal information to the state because they asked of it? I think that's a learning curve for me. Would I? If I've not done anything and I'm just driving and going about my business, does the state have the right to ask that? But it also reminds me of the work that I used to do with children and young people from inner city London, where there were predominantly Black Caribbean communities or ethnic minority communities, whereby their relationship with the state was always fractured, and always a level of distrust that when the police is asking, under this section, we would like to stop you in an area, most people would go, actually, I've not done anything. I'm just passing through. You're profiling me based on my dress, based on my ethnicity. And so I think that's what this story more stimulates for me, in terms of the relationship between the individual and the state, and actually how fractured it is at this moment of time.
Look, and we can circle back and you can listen to us talk about ID cards, which have a clear kind of link to this, which we discussed in a previous episode. There's probably more we can say on this story. I agree with you. I would have real reservations about it. And in any other place, you never have to hand over your phone code. You never have to answer a question. But in this case, you're obliged to answer truthfully. It's a very unusual piece of legislation. So let us move on, because there is a big story we're going to talk about. Danny, is President Trump going to get the Nobel Peace Prize?
Wow.
He has surely brought peace to the Middle East.
Well, I think listening to Keir Starmer, we're recording on Tuesday afternoon. Keir Starmer spoke to the House of Commons at lunchtime today, and he said this is Trump's peace. He very much credited the president as the one who was responsible for securing the peace in Israel and Gaza. Hostages have been returned, but there are still many, many, many obstacles to a long-lasting peace in Israel and Gaza. And then even beyond that, the reconstruction in Gaza is a huge task. But something has changed. Something has tangibly shifted. And the question that I've been reflecting on is, would this have happened without Trump? And I think it does seem that he brought something materially different to the negotiations to bring them together. It has been said that apparently Hamas were growing kind of, the usefulness of the hostages to them was decreasing, and therefore they actually wanted to be done with it, and therefore were in a place to negotiate and release the hostages where they hadn't been before. And I think the true tests will come if Hamas can be demilitarized, if they can be removed, if some form of civil governing structure can be established in Gaza. This is where Tony Blair's going to come into play. If all of those things do actually happen, if a lasting peace holds, if funds for reconstruction come into the region, it's estimated that it will need £50 billion worth of funding to reconstruct Gaza. Over 80% of buildings across Gaza have been significantly damaged, 90+% in Gaza City. Huge damage in that area. The pictures that have been broadcast this week are just showing such devastation to the towns and cities and even villages in that area. So huge amount of work still to go on.
Let's see. So yes, so we've seen hostages released. We've seen some bodies. I think 4 as of this morning that I heard. 3 had been identified. But what has actually been signed? You've looked at the 20-point peace
Oh,
plan. What has been? You've looked at it. I was very careful. I didn't say you'd analysed it in detail for us, but you've had a little bit of a look, and also, what has been achieved and what's left to be done.
A substantial amount is left to be done. What I would say in terms of this plan is that Trump, the United States administration, have led with an economic first agenda rather than what the conversation in Europe and Canada, I would say, led with the statehood agenda. So let's recognize Palestine as a state, and that's the way we're going to lead into seeing change take place here in Israel and between Gaza, yet not having the relational capital of Netanyahu to actually engage with that well. In fact, that would be a very strong, hard wall for him to engage in the table. And I think President Trump and his kind of gusto, his kind of different style of leadership in that sense has won the ear and attention of Netanyahu. And secondly, he has led with a very different direction of let's do the exchange in that sense. Let's then talk about real bills in the area. Let's talk about, it's all about the reconstruction of land and space. And then towards the end of this 20 plan, then talks about statehood, and it's all conditional. And as I was reading it, I don't think this was the value system or the scripture that is led by the Trump administration, but it's kind of like, trusted in little, you would be trusted in much. It's like every stage is like, once you've proven yourself, Hamas, in the sense of you're no longer weapons, you're no longer engaged, and there's greater access by aid, Israel, then we move on to the next step. And then there's probably a greater capability for the conversation around statehood. So it's a completely different approach. It's clearly been percolating for a lot longer than it's been in the media news. And Trump needs a level of kudos. Whether he gets the Nobel Peace Prize, I think is secondary. I think it's more important that there is genuine peace in the Middle East.
I think we prayed last week on this show for this. That's how we ended, I think, last week. And that's what many have been doing throughout this time. And we're just over 2 years on. The role of religion in this, both the conflict itself and how it's resolved, has been something we've talked about actually a couple of times in this podcast. We saw Trump quoting the Bible. We've seen the kind of language around peacemakers and blessed are the peacemakers and some of the chat. Like how do we as Christians and as a church continue to respond to this in ways that are healthy, given some of the religious undertones and given some of the perceptions of how we engage? Danny, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've been reflecting on is not trying to minimize the challenges and the problems that. So last Tuesday, which was the anniversary of October the 7th, I watched a screening of footage from the October the 7th attacks, and it was awful, like harrowing. 47 minutes or collection of body cam footage, CCTV footage, warning that it was mostly uncensored. I think children's faces had been blurred, but apart from that. And I think one of the things that really struck me was the chanting and the joy that people were expressing in the murder of Jewish people. And it drove home the atrocities of October the 7th. If it needed driving home, it really, really did emphasize how awful and barbaric it was. But also the fact that those attacks were celebrated. And I think one of the things to recall is that Hamas were popular in Gaza. I think some of their popularity declined, but they have been popular. They have had significant support. And the tensions in that region, primarily, not exclusively, but primarily along religious lines, are still there. And I think structuring a peace solution that stops people from fighting and killing each other is really important. That is critical. But I think you can't then pretend that the underlying tensions have gone, because they haven't. And actually finding a way to navigate that, to engage with that, to ensure that that you recognise the level of distrust of each other that it still exists in that region. I think that will be essential to any kind of lasting. And I think that's where religion is absolutely crucial, not just for the Muslims and the Jews that are most prominently involved, but actually for the Christian community, both in Israel and the wider Middle East. The role there, churches have been very heavily affected, whether it's churches running hospitals in Gaza, churches in Israel, churches in other places, that actually, whether there's a role there for, peacemaking.
Yeah.
And I think that's something which I would hope that we as Christians all around the world, but in Israel and Gaza particularly, can bring to the table in this situation.
And I think conversations around, or themes around peace, reconciliation, redemption, I think they are theological, not just to Christians, but a religious conversation needs to be at the forefront of how does this kind of war permanently end and move forward. And I think the temptation within particular secular media and humanist thinking is that we don't need to engage in religion. We don't need to talk about religion. And yet that area, that region, that conflict is deeply religious. And actually identity is incredibly important to all involved in terms of their place in the land, their place in society, how they view the conflict. And so I think that's going to be a really challenging space for the secular minds, but it's deeply important for us as Christians, both here in the UK and those supporting ministries within the Middle East, that we keep faith at the fore. And I think a challenge increasingly, just listening to kind of different podcasts talk about the events that have taken place in recent days, is the need for interfaith dialogue. That's part 18 of this plan, that comes in towards the end, that there needs to be this conversation of interfaith dialogue where the predominant faith groups and leaders and communities come together and talk about the future of this land, this area, this region, and politics going forward. And I think here for us in the UK, how do we engage in interfaith dialogue with those from the Jewish community, those from Muslim background, those from other faiths, particularly in terms of how international affairs impacts the streets that we live on, because a lot is being played out on the streets. So I think our faith needs to come to the fore, and a bravery and a courage to engage with people with different religious beliefs on this.
Well, I think if any doubts that Alicia had actually read the plan there, she had, it was section 18 or part 18. I do think that you were noting at the start the kind of economic lead in this, and a less around the two-state solution. I think this is where it begins to get challenged, because identity, statehood, religion, as you say, and we commented, I think, again last week on this, in a secular culture, there's a failure to understand how closely linked identity and religion are. And so I am less convinced that the next piece of work can be done as easily by some of the people at the table. But I also think, and I'm curious your views on this as we wrap this section up, that the link between Israel and the church has been, maybe broken is too strong, but profoundly changed in this encounter. So I would have said 10 years ago, most Christians I knew would have just been broadly supportive of Israel, with little challenge really around that. And at the start of this conflict, it was one of the most kind of interesting, difficult issues to engage in. We said it as we prepared to come on this podcast a number of times and talk about it. This might be the issue we get the most pushback around. We talked to people in government around it, that would have been the view. I think the kind of 100% wholesale support for Israel of the Christian church has shifted. Now, I'm not saying totally, but I also think it has shifted in such a way that will not be easily rebuilt. Israel, modern secular state of Israel, if you like, spent a lot of equity, would be the phrase I would use on this now, and they will not get the same level of support they had. They still do in the States, but everyone else has gone, hold on, you are a modern secular state, you're not claiming biblical ideals. You had an initial right, I would call it, to defend yourself, but beyond that, you went way above and beyond any common understanding of what that looked like. And I think you've complicated that relationship. And I think part of that's probably good and healthy. I think it was a very simplistic view that was held before. So I think from a church point, there is a nervousness even to respond and even to engage in this topic, because every pastor and every church leader knows if they say anything on this, there'll be a chunk, 10% or 15% of their church will not be happy from a pro-Israel side, and 10-15% will not be happy from a more Palestine side, and a lot in the middle are just confused. There, end of my rant. Any comments?
Yeah. So a former MP and government minister, Alistair Burt, who I once upon a time worked for, he was at one point the minister for the Middle East. He posted something on X this week, quoting back to a tweet that he wrote early in 2024, effectively saying, October 7th attacks were awful. Hamas must release the hostages. Israel's response has gone too far. And I feel like those three pieces of perspective are broadly what people think. Mm-hmm. People will put different emphases in different places, that the original attacks were horrendous. Hamas should have released the hostages far earlier. But Israel's response, I think Peter used this in a previous conversation, was vengeful. The destruction that has been brought on Gaza is crazy. And I think they have lost some of their support. For some people, it will be viewed that they were, as long as Hamas continued to hold the hostages and continued to engage in terrorist activities, Israel were justified in continuing their pursuit. But I think I wonder how it has shifted opinions. I wonder how that has changed.
And it's also very difficult that we've had for the last 2 years images of destruction being displayed on the screen, and to ask, I mean, it's easy to ask from the comfort of where we're living, but is that the best way to see hostages released? And I totally understand their pursuit and their desire, and absolutely in all that they were doing, but we are left with visible shots of children, young people, women completely kind of vanish. We're looking at landscapes that used to have buildings completely desolate. I mean, people are returning to Gaza, and I'm not quite sure what they're returning to, because they don't have the material to reconstruct entire cities and towns. So I think that's that visual. It's easy for war. It's very hard to rebuild. And I think that's the part that is going to be challenging for leaders. But ultimately, how do you rebuild with a vision of hope that there could actually be sustained peace in the Middle East? I think that's the part that us as church, it needs to navigate.
Great. You've mentioned sustained peace, so I'm going to put you on the spot, both of you. Alicia, a year from now, will Donald Trump have the Nobel Peace Prize?
No.
Danny?
Yes.
Oh, there you go. A split room. One of those clips will go viral.
And if everyone looks at previous things where Danny puts his head above the parapet, how many have come true?
I'm not afraid of
being wrong. That's good.
Yep.
Being wrong, Danny. Well, listen, if you like what you're listening to, this is, of course, Cross Section. Why not share it with a friend or family? If you would love to like and review it, that would be fantastic. But why not just take a pause wherever you are, throw it and text a mate and say, hey, should we listen to Cross Section? These guys are funny and make crazy predictions, if not talk sensibly about what's going on in the world from a Christian perspective. Do check out our cross-section page. You can get show notes, links to some of the resources. And we have a politics and policy survey out right now. You should find that on social media. Danny will definitely tweet it straight after the show if you're on that. You'll find it on the eauk.org website if you hunt long enough and find it. I don't know where.
Hopefully on the front page.
Anyway,
hopefully on the front
it'll
page.
be on the front page right now, Danny says, because he's got power and influence and I do not. We're still trying to find mugs. There are two with me. I already made that joke, didn't I? So we just have to keep going. Don't worry. Email us at cross.section@eauk.org if you've got any feedback. If you'd like to hear us cover something, do let us know. We are not going to speak about rehabilitation because this is a semi-live show and we are definitely running long on that. So let's move forward. We are going to talk about religious hate crimes to wrap things up.
Oh, wow.
We can't do justice to the rehabilitation of Morgan story, I don't think, unless somebody absolutely kind of gives me just refuses to answer the next question and goes back to it. I think religious hate crime has reached a record high. Faith leaders have called for unity in that. That was the kind of headline. I think that was Premier News were running that. That is technically true. It is up 3% in last year. I think we need to keep that in context. Most of that came from some of the attacks on the Muslim community post-Southport. You can see a very clear spike. I'm not in any way minimizing that, but I am saying there's a very clear correlation on that. Mm-hmm. So in response, Sadiq Khan made a speech saying all beliefs are welcome in London, though he may not have used that phrase. So we shouldn't allow extremists to divide us. How do we navigate some of the religious hate speech going on at this moment? Alyssa, you can go first because Danny's been first on the previous two. What about Sadiq Khan's speech? All faiths are welcome in London to protest every weekend. He didn't say that second bit.
No, he didn't. He didn't say the other part that you said. You've teed this up interestingly, Peter. You've definitely teed this up interestingly.
The headline was "All beliefs are welcome in London," but he probably
Yes.
didn't write the headline, is what we're saying.
Agree. And whoever did write the headline, I would challenge them to, do they truly believe that? Because I think when, as we said earlier in the episode, where you have faith practice that has social action that's received, but theological convictions on moral issues, you're soon excluded from the table or conversations. I mean, London is unique and diverse in the sense that it's a population full of difference. There are religious communities, religious identities, and there's deep challenges. Geopolitics has come to the streets of London, where for the last 2 years, primarily, there has been weekly protests around Gaza and Palestine. And it is the role of the mayor to show a level of leadership to bring the city, the capital, together, and to bring a level of, you are safe to be who you are in the capital and you are welcome. So he said the right message, and it's definitely a timely message for here and now. But I don't think it's enough, if I'm being perfectly honest. I think there's more that needs to be done in the capital in terms of, I think there needs to be a stronger response around some of the Palestinian marches. They're not just protests. I have seen and witnessed and heard comments towards the Jewish community that are vile, that I do think hit the threshold of criminality, and it's gone kind of without punishment and without a sense of kind of action from the police. It's just seen and observed. And that space of hostility has brewed for many years, that we're now in a position and a state whereby religious difference is tolerated, not celebrated. And there are particular communities, yes, the Jewish community alongside the Muslim community, that feel deeply fearful. So he's saying the right things, but I'm not sure he's doing enough in terms of leadership to really take what's his responsibility to move forward on this.
Danny, I'm going to come to you, but I just want to say, so most hate crime relates to race. That is by far and away the largest. Religion is relatively small. So out of 115,000, 82,000 are to do with race, 7,000 religion. The highest number within the religion is to do with the Muslim community. But when you take it per head of population, for every 10,000 people, the Jewish numbers are 106 per 10,000, Muslim 12 per 10,000, the Christian are actually 0, so it's way less than 1. So one of the comments related to Christians, and there just are relative, I mean, almost none against Christians for their religion, by far and away is the Jewish community. Danny, any reflections on that as we wrap things up?
Two thoughts. One that ties in with what you've just said is the definitions of what we mean by hate crime and hate speech, and whether it is perceived as that. And I think when we hear about both violence but also very aggressive, very threatening speech towards Jewish people is at its most visible. I think it's quite easy to see that as a hate crime and as something that should be prosecuted. I think sometimes as Christians, we take a view that Christians are persecuted in other parts of the world, but actually a bit of an insult is something that we should just shrug off and not worry about. So if someone insults me for my faith or says something that's not very nice about Christianity or Christians, well, okay, but I'm not going to call it a hate crime. I think sometimes things like lead theft from the roof of church buildings has been categorized as a hate crime against Christians. So I think there are complexities behind the definitions and the designations of hate crime and how Christians perceive themselves in relation to that. And some people just don't like it. They think crime is crime and should be dealt with as crime, but putting a religious designation on it complicates it. The other thing, and I think this cuts to the heart of the Sadiq Khan comments and the headline, whether or not he used it, is we all want to exclude some beliefs. All of us have some beliefs that we don't think are welcome. I think usually the way that happens is that happens in terms of what your classic secular politician does is they try and separate out extremist views within a faith from the faith itself and say that's not representative of Muslims or that's not representative of Christians or Jews or Sikhs, and try and make that kind of theological intra-religious distinction to say all religions are welcome here, but not those ones that say things under the label of their religion that we don't like. So they then get to decide what counts as a religion and what doesn't, and say that's not a religious belief, that's just an extremist belief. But I just think we need a slightly more nuanced willingness to say, actually, well, there are some things that we're not happy with, but then the problem is they might say that about us. And it's what might they not like about what Christians believe and what Christians say? And how do we navigate that when we're talking about working together and social cohesion and integration? And that gets much more challenging for secular politicians.
Well, we wrap things up, I think, reflecting on Israel-Palestine and that things have moved in the right direction. There are glimmers of hope when we continue to pray for peace in that region. And we acknowledge the contested nature of the place that we're living in, from signs in Canterbury Cathedral that arguably are much ado about nothing, through to something more substantial that requires us to really wrestle with things like religious hate crime, how we understand that, and our persecuted brothers and sisters around the world. We do need wisdom to navigate this more contested space. We hope we're providing just a little smidge of that. We'd love your feedback to hear how we can do that better and do more of that. We'll continue to have this conversation. But our prayer right now is that what is happening in the Middle East will, I suppose, create space for more peaceful conversations here on some of these topics. But we acknowledge there are wonderful things going on. People continue to come to faith. But the journeys in the way they do that might not be the way we expect. And there will continue to be challenges as we navigate some of these public conversations about faith in the public square that Andy Burnham talked about in his Theos lecture. Thanks for joining us. We'll continue to have this conversation. We hope to see you again next week. Be blessed.